Whether you're a veteran of Dice and Dungeons or a newcomer to the table, we welcome you to the Systemaniac podcast, where we break down tabletop role-playing systems both popular and niche so that you can discover your next campaign setting. Our first system comparison departs from the magical realm of Dungeons & Dragons and into perhaps the second most recognizable system and setting, the dark, eldritch world of Call of Cthulhu. My name is Evan, rulebook thumper and part-time keeper, and I'm joined today by Joe, a player in the system and a general roleplay enthusiast, as we delve into the maddening system of Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. So, I'm sitting here with Joe. He's here to help us break down the system. How are you doing today, Joe?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. So, first things first, just want to learn a little bit more about you since we got you here on the podcast. So, how long have you been role-playing in general?
I've been role-playing in general for about 2 years or so.
I know that your primary system is the Fantasy Flight role-playing system. How much time have you spent in the Call of Cthulhu system?
Not a whole lot of time.
Although it is something that I know you've spent quite a while looking into. It's something that I really enjoy as well. I've not gotten to play in it much personally. I just spend a lot of time with the book because I'm one of those people. But regardless, so we'll dive right on into the actual system comparison. So with the theme of the podcast being comparing everything to Dungeons & Dragons, we'll start off with perhaps the biggest question. What is, system-wise, the biggest difference between D&D and Call of Cthulhu?
I'd say the biggest difference is that Call of Cthulhu really focuses in on an atmosphere. It's definitely meant to be dark and creepy and foreboding, whereas Dungeons & Dragons is meant to be more open-ended and it can be whatever the GM wants it to be when it's written. And obviously you can mold pretty much any RPG to your specifications, but this one is definitely meant to be much more psychological horror.
Yeah, and I'd fully agree with you on that. The Call of Cthulhu system, especially with expanded rules for things such as sanity and how your person is, like you don't wear armor or gain magical skills. I mean, you're a normal human being, and in the real world, facing these horrible monstrosities. So it certainly makes it very interesting to play. Of course, it might not be quite for everybody. So how might that philosophy affect somebody who currently plays D&D might want to get into Call of Cthulhu? Would there be a huge change in philosophy, or is it something that you think they could easily transition into?
Well, in terms of role-playing games as a whole, Call of Cthulhu is pretty easy to transition into. I would definitely only recommend it if that kind of genre, like horror, psychological horror, is something that you're into, because I know you definitely don't see that a lot in more high fantasy typed games. So I would say it's definitely easy enough to get into if you're familiar with RPGs at all, but you definitely want to be somebody who's more interested in scary stuff.
Yeah. Well, and that being said, on the topic of horror, it does certainly play on horror elements, although I wouldn't quite say that it is horror in the same way that going to see a horror movie is like. Like, you know, there's nothing that jumps off the page. It's more the, oh crap, I'm not wearing any armor, I've got like 2 bullets in my gun, the gun itself isn't very good, and now there's a big snake monster thing in front of me. So it almost seems more game-type horror, which works really well, and it, like you mentioned before, with the atmosphere being so important, I think that it works really well for that. And with that, you mentioned briefly, you kind of need to be somebody who's into that atmosphere. What if you're someone who's never played a role-playing game? Would Call of Cthulhu be a good place to start, or would you recommend going into a different system first?
Call of Cthulhu is definitely a good place to start in terms of role-playing games. It's easy to find somebody to play with because it's one of the most popular systems out there. And in terms of complexity, once you get past the opening stages of the game, which are, character creation, setting up the world, it's a pretty easy game to get into and stay into. So yes, I would say it's definitely a good place to start in terms of role-playing games.
Again, I'll agree with that as well. I do think it's a bit tough for newcomers coming in, because having walked down through the character creation, you and I have sat down and made characters before, and man, how long did it take us? It was like an hour and a half or 2 hours or something ridiculous. It took us
quite a while.
It took a very long time to sit down and crunch all the numbers out. There's like 9 different main stats, and you've got the whole big long list of skills, and the character sheet itself will probably drive you insane just looking at it, but now that we've harped on the character creation a whole bunch, is playing the game itself actually difficult?
Playing the game itself is not difficult at all. It can be intense because there's some mechanics that you're not used to in other role-playing games, like keeping track of your psychological state. You can go insane in this game, and you will constantly have to make rolls based on your sanity. And the big difference in rolls in this game between that and D&D is a D20 system. So you'll start with your base skill and then add that on to a D20. In this game, you're rolling percentages. So you'll be rolling 2 D10s, one for the tens place and one for the ones place, and your whole goal goal is to roll a number that is lower than your character's skill. So say you have a skill of 40 in firearms, you want to roll a 40 or lower out of 100 in order to complete that check. And then you can also add on, greater success or greater benefits, say if you roll less than half of what your skill is. So say your skill is a 40 and you roll 20 or lower, the GM can say, okay, well, you get some extra benefit on top of that.
Cool. And you'd say that this is easier than the D&D system in ways.
It's easier in certain ways, but more complex in others, but I would say it balances out pretty well.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So, moving on to the next one, going into Call of Cthulhu, I do want to revisit atmosphere real quick, because we already harped on it a little bit, but I do want to kind of revisit. So what has to change from, again, somebody playing in that D&D mindset of being, the hero clad in armor, wielding an axe, charging at the dragon? How do you have to change your mindset going over and playing? Can you still play that way? Is the style similar?
Generally in Call of Cthulhu, absolutely not. Your number one goal in Call of Cthulhu is to survive. Vulnerability is the name of the game here. Your mind is vulnerable, your body is vulnerable, you're not a massive killing machine that can magically heal yourself. You are a human, so your entire goal the whole time is to stay alive, more so than it is to try to kill the thing. You can always come back and try to do it later, but don't die.
Yeah, and that probably plays into the horror aspect of it as well, with being vulnerable. There's no armor save or anything. You're a normal human being, and if the enemy attacks you and it succeeds on its roll, you're taking some damage, and depending on what's attacking you, you can't take very much of that damage before you got to keel over. So yeah. That's a very good way to put it, and I do like that. I think that's one of the reasons that I like that system a lot. It focuses a lot more on the humanity of the characters that are being played, because they're normal human beings. I mean, there's a little bit of magic in it that you can use, but all of it is a trade-off. You can cast this spell, but you might go insane doing it. So a lot of it boils down to what can you as a human being in this world come up with. That's one of the reasons that I really like it, and I think it's done really well.
Another major difference that you would come across that you don't necessarily see in D&D is that Cthulhu is a lot more based on knowledge skills, so the players are all referred to as investigators, and the game master is referred to as the keeper of arcane lore, or keeper for short. So a lot of your gameplay is going to be based on doing research, not necessarily combat or those kinds of things. You need to study ahead of time and use all of these huge, different, diverse knowledge skills in order to defeat an opponent.
Investigative gameplay, which I do love myself a little bit of investigative gameplay. So we're coming up to the end of the podcast. We'll go through the last portion, which is just the rapid fire stats. So all I need from you, I'll ask just a quick question. I just need a number, 1 through 10. First things first, ease of access. How easy is the game to pick up and learn?
I would say it's about a 7.
Alrighty. Ease of play. Once you know the rules, how easy is it to play the game?
Probably an 8.
Alright, and last but not least, ease of fun. Is the system fun to play in?
Absolutely. Give that a 9.
Alrighty, you heard it here. It is a 6, a 7, and then a 9. Thank you, Joe, for joining me for today, and we hope to see you again. As usual, thank you listeners for tuning in, and we hope that you've learned a bit more about the Call of Cthulhu system. Make sure not to miss next week when our guest will be helping us break down one of the newest systems on the market, Fantasy Flight Games' narrative dice system for Star Wars role-playing. Until then, best of luck, be brave, and don't stop rolling. We'll see you next week.